Welcome back. I hope you've been able to have a small break of 10 minutes. After the wonderful introduction to implementation research, let's now get deeper into implementation research and look at theories and frameworks of implementation research and what they are and why they are important. This session will be conducted by Dr. Jose Martinez. Let me just quickly introduce Dr. Jose Martinez. Dr. Jose Martinez is specialized in pediatrics and had obtained his MSc and PhD from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine in London. In 1988, he joined the WHO, the World Health Organization, in charge of a working group for research on the prevention of diarrhea. He later became the coordinator of the WHO Maternal, Newborn, Child and Adolescent Health Research and Development team until his retirement in 2013. He currently is the scientific coordinator of the Center for Intervention Science in Maternal and Child Health, which is a center of excellence of the Research Council of Norway, based at the University of Bergen in Norway. And he's also a member of the technical advisory group of Prerna, and he has been a mentor to many of us young scientists in Prerna. So welcome, Dr. Jose, and I'd like to invite you to please begin with your presentation.
Thank you very much, Sudipto. It's a pleasure to join the group. The only sad thing is that we cannot be together for this workshop. And here is my hope that maybe the next we'll have a chance to see each other face to face. I thought of starting. Can you hear me well? Hello?
Yeah, you
can
hear
you?
me.
Oh,
yeah,
wonderful.
Jose, very clearly.
Wonderful, thank you. I plan to start making clear to you what are my objectives with this presentation, and I have two. The first is that by the time you reach the formulation of your questions, you have greater clarity on what implementation research is about, under what type of framework implementation research operates. This is made much simpler following Rajiv, because coming from the same stable, I think that we do share quite a bit of the vision on what implementation research is and should be. But my second objective is that you also reach the development of your proposal with an understanding that your project will gain from having an explicit model, a model that can guide you in making sure that you follow a logical sequence, that you use all information that is relevant in order to inform your study. I should also tell you what this presentation is not. And it's not going to be a comprehensive listing of what types of theoretical models may inform implementation research, nor I will go in any depth in terms of the theories that underlie these models. So I hope that this won't be a disappointment to anyone. So I will first, as I was not totally sure how far Rajiv would go, give you a brief understanding of how I see implementation research, and then to move towards the implementation research models. So Implementation research has been more consistently in the recent past described as a scientific inquiry, it is research, into questions that concern implementation. And this focus on implementation is clearly important, and it may be the key factor in differentiating it from other areas of research. The next definition from another source, but from an influential paper on closing the no-do gap that appeared in the Lancet 2 years ago. It involves the creation and application of knowledge to improve the implementation. Implementation can be of policies, programs, or even practices. It has very specific characteristics. The first is that it deals with implementation problems. It does require understanding of the context. It makes use of various disciplines, so it's usually multidisciplinary. It should be rigorous, and it should have an adaptive process. And Rajiv mentioned to you quite a few times the cycles of readjustment. And it can have a very ample utility. It can look into feasibility, adoption, acceptance of interventions, can look into coverage, and more recently, also looking into coverage specifically for more disadvantaged groups. But it can also examine quality, equity, efficiency, how to achieve scale, how to achieve sustainability. We had already a question looking for, well, what is the difference between implementation research and operational research? And what I see sort of more recently in terms of definitions of implementation research is that it tends to be a lot broader. So, and trying to incorporate several traditions of research. So it involves, in some cases, improvement of management, operation research, policy implementation, program evaluation, dissemination and implementation of evidence-based medicine, and also participatory research. We'll have a session that looks into formulating questions, so I won't go into the typical questions that come more from these traditions of research. But I think that from an early period when there was an attempt to be very specific and very restrictive about what implementation research was, we are getting now to a more flexible and more responsive use of implementation research. So it deals with implementation, but it can and it will make use of tools and experiences that comes from various sources. But saying that, let's move into models and how models can help us in conducting better implementation research. The first is a realization that you can never avoid to have a model. Whether you know the model you are applying, whether you have made it explicit or not, your study will inevitably reflect your way or your team's way of approaching the solution of a problem. There is a model that guides or misguides you in making choices, be them the selection of interventions, the design of interventions, their delivery, their evaluation. What I tried to tell you, to convince you that, is that if you are aware of your model, and if you make your model also visible to others, this will help you and the others to identify possible problems in your way of conceptualizing your research, planning for implementation, implementing or evaluating. So there is a lot to gain from having a model. And maybe the main problem is that models are sometimes so involved in difficult language that it's difficult to see how they could be understood or useful. Well, looking at models, and I made an attempt to see if I could present to you a very concise approach to, well, these are the 3 or 5 key models that you should consider as you develop your proposal. And I was running into trouble until I came across one quote from the with the Implementation Science Resource Hub that the University of Washington's put together. And there I read with a smile, there are dozens of theories, models, frameworks used in implementation science that have been developed across a wide range of disciplines, and more are published each year. Unfortunately, the vast number of theory models, frameworks available can make it difficult to determine which is the most appropriate to address or to frame a research question. So after a period of thinking, oh gosh, yes, having so many makes the choice impossible, I decided to be positive. So we can use the availability, the large availability, to look and choose which model may better suit your needs, your project needs. Oops. Let me see, I moved too fast. Something that helped me in sort of navigating the universe of models is a paper by Per Nielsen, Making Sense of Implementation Theories, Models and Frameworks, that Implementation Science published in 2015. And in it, they have a diagram that categorizes 3 types of theoretical approaches that are used in implementation science. One, the first, is the one I'm most familiar with, is the use of models to describe and or guide the process of translating research into practice. But there are models that are important in terms of guiding your understanding or finding explanations for what influences implementation outcomes and what influences people's behavior. And there is a third category that focuses essentially on evaluating implementation. So what I propose to do for the rest of this session is to cover some of the aspects under each of these categories, but with a focus, a primary focus on process models. Process models are particularly helpful when you have a project, or when you want a way of guiding the process of translating policy or intervention recommendations into practices or programs. To me, this is the closest that we have in terms of closing the no-do gap. So you know something is effective, you want to find how this can be done in a program. I picked 3 types of models to describe to you. One is called dynamic sustainability. A second one is called the EPIS model. And the third is dynamic adaptation. And as you'll see, this we are always learning of ways to improve it. If it is a treatment, if it is a vaccine, if it is a hygiene practice, we always have some new knowledge that comes that leads to some adaptation and improvement. But the settings also change. So where people live is changing. So a setting where no running water was available, it starts having running water. A setting where breastfeeding is a common practice, the practice may be eroded by advertising. And there is also an ecological system that stands for sort of the larger system beyond the community, the local government, the state government. The idea of the dynamic sustainability is that sustained success depends on negotiated and reciprocal fit of an intervention with a setting and at the practice setting with the larger environment. So when you arrive with an intervention, you have to adjust this intervention to the population where the intervention is being delivered. And this setting where the population lives and the resources that you have for the intervention are also interacting all the time with a larger system that may be, for example, providing the resources for the intervention to be implemented. Dynamic sustainability suggests that optimal fit requires that characteristics of the intervention, the practice setting, and the ecological system be consistently followed, and it expects that intervention, the settings, the ecological system will change over time. In some studies, this will be reflected in the multiple cycles of adaptation that Rajiv mentioned before. But we have models that took into consideration this need for adaptation in a clearer way, and we are going to see them. Closing the discussion on the process, the dynamic sustainability model, data can dynamically suggest intervention improvements to meet the needs of patients, how to modify the skills and resources within the setting where the practice takes place, and the larger ecology. So this really reinforcing the need to get data in order to improve your intervention response to the situation and to the needs of where it is applied. A model that underlies the model that Rajiv shared with you during his presentation is the EPIS model. And EPIS contains 4 main planks. The first is exploration, the E, preparation, P, implementation, and sustainment. The model first appeared in 2010, but in 2018, or by 2018, it had already been refined to make sure that it was really used with an alignment for rapid cycle testing. So making clear the understanding that this steps need to happen more than once, and there is a process of feedback in order to improve their performance, improve their implementation. Oh God, sorry. So let me talk about the exploration phase. So if you are going to be active in a specific setting, you need to understand it. The exploration phase is a space for you to consider what are the health needs and for you to identify what are the most likely interventions or approaches to address those needs. In addition, it considers what has to be adapted at the system level, organization, and or individual levels, and also adaptations of the intervention itself. So, for example, when promoting kangaroo mother care, one adaptation was for us to try to continue with the practice at home level, to offer the mothers binders so that they could tie the baby against their chest and they could have their hands free to do the housework. So adaptations of the practice can also be learned while you explore how best to implement your intervention. They have a preparatory phase, and during this preparation phase, you look for potential barriers, potential facilitators, what may need adaptation, and you develop your plans using the knowledge on facilitators and barriers in order to get your intervention readier for implementation. So the critical step during this preparation phase is really to get all your supports needed for implementation ready. So the training, the developed trainers, how to do coaching, how to get the monitoring developed so that you could improve the performance of your intervention. The idea is to have all the supports that you need or that you believe you'll need to facilitate the adoption of the intervention that will start now to be taken to implementation in the next phase. So the implementation phase is when the intervention is initiated. And when you initiate intervention implementation, you should have also ongoing monitoring so that you can see how it's moving, how it needs to adjust it in order to be more successful. And then after you have a phase of intervention implementation, you have this phase of sustainment. You continue to deliver the intervention, but you start to bring in adaptations that may be necessary to keep the impact, but also to keep the intervention continuing for a longer period of time, so that the effects are maintained, they can continue to be obtained by the population. The third of the process models that I thought might be useful to share with you is the dynamic adaptation. When one comes into research with the training in conducting randomized trials, one of the difficulties that we have when shifting to implementation research is that we feel uncomfortable about adaptation. So how much can an intervention be adapted and still be faithful to what was previously tested, what is the core for the effectiveness of the intervention? And yet dynamic adaptation does try to pay a closer attention to it. So it's designed to allow for intervention, system, and any organization's adaptations to happen in a planned and considered protocol-guided way, rather than having adaptations to happen ad hoc. It involves identifying what are core elements, what are adaptable characteristics of an intervention. So there are things you can't change. One example, kangaroo mother care. You cannot have kangaroo mother care if you don't have skin-to-skin care. But there are other elements that can be adapted and still preserve the intervention core. And then you support implementation with specific training on the allowable adaptations to the model. You measure the fidelity and you provide the support for the intervention to be adopted and sustaining. And you identify the needs that may still have for solution to system blocks or to organizational blocks that also require adaptations so that they better take and they facilitate the uptake of the intervention. Dynamic adaptation, as all as probably all models in implementation research, uses a mixed method approach to advance implementation. It tries to address the tension between adaptation and fidelity, as I mentioned before, and examine what are the best mechanisms and methods to improve fidelity assessment, and also to continue to preserve the core characteristics of the intervention while making it more implementable. The next category is one that I will barely touch, and that's the need for understanding and/or explaining what influences implementation outcomes. This is an area that is mostly related to behavior change and educational theories, and I just picked one to show you the type of issues that it covers. So the idea is really to understand what are the influences that affect the implementation outcomes. One point is that intervention outcomes are probably always dependent on human behavior. Interventions may be improved by drawing on theories of human behavior, and the number of approaches and theories that have been developed essentially in the field of psychology is huge, and many of these theories overlap. So a recent review that I looked identified 128 explanatory constructs, and they came from 33 psychological theories that had been identified. So it's a huge field, extremely valuable, but that I thought I wouldn't be the person to cover during this presentation. A summary of elements that are important in this area and that contribute to our understanding of how to improve implementation of interventions includes that implementation and success in implementation depends a lot on the nature of the behavior. So what needs to be changed? Some behaviors are easier to change than others. So smoking continues still to be an example of a behavior that is difficult to change, despite very significant progress in reducing the rates of smoking in the population. There are specific knowledge and skills, but we also know that just knowledge or just skills are not sufficient. Clarity on the goal helps a lot in obtaining the desired behavior change. Also, the beliefs that the individual, the recipient of the intervention, has about what are the consequences, so what are the benefits, what are the losses, and the beliefs of the individual in terms of what he or she is capable of doing. Adoption of a behavior can be a lot helped if there is a goal plan, if there is already an understanding on how this change can be achieved. Social environment and physical environment play a very important role in adoption. They can facilitate it, they can make it much harder. So taking all these elements into account certainly inform our way of making the promotion of a certain practice more successful. The final of these models relates to the evaluation of implementation. And the model that I wanted to share with you is probably the most appreciated of the evaluation models. It is the RE-AIM model. It exists, it was presented the first time 20 years ago. And part of it was because there was a concern that efficacy studies weren't very helpful, I would say, weren't helpful enough in informing program scale up or the understanding of how to reach public health impact with an intervention. I mentioned to you that it's a very popular model. It has been cited in nearly 3,000 different publications, and it appears very frequently in grant applications for intervention evaluation in the US. RE-AIM addresses 5 dimensions of individual or setting level outcomes that are important for program impact and sustainability. They are the reach, the effectiveness, the adoption, the implementation, and the maintenance. And when evaluating your approach to implementation, you look for those outcomes. And the use of the terminology, I think that coincides a lot with what we normally use in practice. So reach refers to the absolute number or the proportion, but also to the representativeness of the individuals who participate in a given intervention or program. So who is reached by the intervention? The second is the effectiveness, and it looks into what is the impact of the intervention on the valued outcomes. So it includes both benefits, negative effects, effects on quality of life, and economic outcomes. Adoption is the number, proportion, also representativeness of either settings, if it is, the settings are the, I will call, I was going to say the unit of randomization. If the intervention is directed to specific settings, and intervention agents, individuals who initiate a program or who initiate the intervention. They are the adopters of the intervention that you promote. Implementation refers to the interventions agents' fidelity to the intervention or to adaptation of the intervention and to the implementation strategies that you devised. So if it is, the intervention is delivered faithfully to the plan with the same time that it was intended and within the costs that you had planned. And maintenance is the extent to which a program or policy becomes institutionalized, becomes part of the routine practices and policies of that system. Maintenance also applies to individual level. and it applies to programs and their effects on outcome. RE-AIM keeps evolving, and the more recent applications of RE-AIM already are looking into costs and looking farther into the adaptation of AIM to programs, and also more and more using methods to understand better how and why some of the results in terms of reach, effectiveness, adoption, implementation, or maintenance came about. To close, I would like to go back to the first statement that whether you make it explicit or not, your study will inevitably have a model, and that if you make your model explicit, if others have access to your model and can criticize it, you will get towards a better project because you conceptualize better, you plan better, you implement, and you evaluate better your study actions. Having a good model can become a main contributor for your study success at the proposal assessment level, but also at the implementation level. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jose. Thank you very much, I think, for explaining this such a complex topic in such simple terms. You have explained, and as Dr. Jose said, that in half an hour, you can't really get it in depth, but this was a very informative overview on theories and frameworks in implementation research. Okay, I'll now request the attendees first, participants, to ask question, either raise their hands and we'll unmute them, or you can type in your questions. So I think we have a participant, Runa Ghosh, who would like to ask a question. So we'll just unmute you and then you can directly ask the question to Dr. Jose. Okay. Okay, I think she isn't responding, but it's okay. I think when she's back, maybe we can ask her to raise a question. We have a couple of questions, Dr. Jose, out here right now. So the question that comes to most of us is, what determines what? I mean, sometimes we have a preconceived methodology and then we look for models to fit that methodology. Or is this the right way to go? Or should we first select a model and then decide a methodology based on a framework or a model? You know, we sometimes tend to get confused in this.
Yeah, well, and it is difficult to be prescriptive. I think that my relationship with models became a lot friendlier when I accepted that, well, first I need to know what my project is about. So, and that was sort of when I looked into those three categories. So is it to describe and to guide sort of the process of implementation, or do I have a project that is really focusing more on evaluation? I have had very few projects in my life that looked into understanding and explaining the influences on behavior and behavior outcomes. But the moment that you make already the selection, you get much narrower, and then at the simplest level, the models tend to have sort of a lot of elements in common. So I think that the moment you get into specifying, you can look at what type of model may suit the best the exploration of your question. And one thing that happens very often is that the moment you become familiar with one model, you tend to use and improve your use of that model in different families of projects that you have. So using Rajiv as an example, the moment we reached the model that was used in KMC Scale Up, we keep using it in several generations of new projects. But the important is to have sort of the elements that compose the model explicitly identified, because then you can make sure that you are covering all the bases. And also you can look for further learning on how better to perform each of the steps.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Jose. And a related question to this is there a kind of a guide or a guideline to help researchers to select a model, or it depends on the research question or is something like that?
Yeah, I think that you can narrow down your selection depending on the question that you have. So the simplest is sort of in the 3 types of boxes in the Nielsen diagram. But from then on, you can go into different selections of models that fit into that box. And they really depend a lot on your context, your team, the type of experience they have. And as I mentioned before, your experience in previous projects with a given model tend to lead you to try to stick with that model and get it more perfect in the application. Or if you feel, well, it failed me, then you drop it. There is one site that I recommend you use, and that is the University of Washington site that I find easy to navigate, very comprehensive, and I don't know if I have it, I should have it identified when I use the quote. Oh yeah, at the bottom of the slide, you have the address, and it has a very nice section on frameworks that provides good references to models and access to several papers that describe studies that use the models for their implementation.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Jose. And I think just to add, Dr. Jose, I think the University of Washington, they also run online courses in implementation research. So that's another resource that that interested participants can look at.
That's right.
Right. Okay. We have a couple of more questions. One is any comment on how these theories have come up, or the origins of these theories?
Well, the theories predate implementation research, and some of them have their origin on management. Some of them have their origin on psychology. So what we have is really implementation research trying to get the most of traditions that preceded it. So, and when we look into sort of the number of different research traditions that in a way can be used for implementation research, and that they were already around before we sort of coined the term implementation research, it becomes clear that models came earlier, but models have been used and improved and continue to be adapted. So I shared with you models that still kept improving, such as with the introduction of a cycling mode, because cycling is something that is particularly important for implementation research.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Jose. I think Ranadeep has a question. So if we could just unmute, if we can unmute Ranadeep.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, sir.
Hi, Ranadeep.
Hello, sir. Thank you for an excellent presentation. So one point that Dr. Rajiv also raised, that for implementation research, suppose there is a new program. I am not talking about new vaccine. I am talking about suppose a new program, and maybe could be anything. I am just thinking about now maybe some preconception program, as because we are working in WINGS. So suppose we have an effective or efficacious RCT, and we have some positive finding from that randomized control trial that interventions delivered during pre and periconception period will have some impact on adverse pregnancy outcome. So this is the evidence now we have. Now suppose this evidence now has to be translated into the health system, but we don't have any prior experience of this particular program to be included in the health system. Though maybe there are some programs that they are like anemia prophylaxis program for women of reproductive age group, but this is much more beyond that, because this is much more comprehensive. So in that kind of situation, when we have an effective intervention or package of interventions in our hand, but we don't have any prior experience of implementing that particular package into the health system or integrate with the health system, then how implementation research, number one, and which models of this implementation research we can think to design, so that we can have a fair bit of idea that how this program can be integrated into the health system before we actually start to implement.
Yeah, well, you in Sharmila's presentation in a couple of days, I think that it may be only up to, it's only going to be on Saturday. We will have, to some extent, a similar situation, although we knew that KMC was efficacious. we really had no idea of how to implement KMC at scale. 40 years on, we still sort of had hospitals not implementing it. So I think that especially in situations where there is very limited experience, you need a good phase of exploration. And exploration needs to be as economical as possible. And by economical, I mean you try to make maximum use of previous experiences that are not exactly the same, but may inform what you want to do. But nothing will replace your ability to look into the specific intervention that you have on hand. So you can look into, okay, what happened during the efficacy trials? Can I learn something from them? What happened in other fields? What should I expect to be important factors? But exploration and preparation are a lot more important and require a lot more effort when you have a new intervention that has never been implemented before or never been implemented at scale before. But I think that for those situations, the EPIS model, and especially the rapid cycle EPIS model, is a very good one because it allows you to be learning at each of your steps, and it allows you to go back. So you explore, you learn something that you think, okay, yeah, this type of element will be important to prepare. But when you have your first attempt to use it, you find a problem, you can go back quickly one step, redo what you were planning, and come back to the implementation stage. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, sir, definitely. Even you can discuss this later also. So sometimes also people talk about a pragmatic trial. So because the way we do randomized control trial, we try to make an ideal situation sometimes. But that gives us the efficacy of that particular, suppose any intervention, say X. Now sometimes people say that you can translate that whether that X is as equivalent or as non-inferior to that ideal situation. People sometimes do some pragmatic trial with the same intervention delivered by the health system workers, but in an controlled trial environment, but delivered by maybe by health system people. So that also sometimes gives whether that intervention can be implemented in for that particular segment of the population. And then people sometimes talk about, after that, learning from that, go to implement and do implementation research subsequently. So I have understood this EPIS model. I read a bit about this, but whether this second phase of this so-called pragmatic trial with the health system people does make any sense. I think what I have understood from your presentation, it doesn't make too much sense, because if we have an efficacious intervention, we should, and if we want to implement that in the health system, or we want to integrate that with the health system, we should go by this exploration, preparation, implementation, and sustainable by a iterative process to implement that. I think that is the way to do.
Yeah, we who come from sort of, we grew up thinking that well, we need always to have a randomized control trial to be sure that the intervention works. But by the time we get to implementation research, the question has really changed. If we don't know the efficacy, or if we don't have a clear idea of the effectiveness of the intervention, then we are not yet ready for conducting implementation research with that intervention. We are still a bit earlier. We wouldn't like to find ways of implementing that intervention at large scale in a sustained way if we don't know whether it's safe or effective. So we reach implementation research when we have a lot of confidence that what we are going to promote is something that is efficacious. We may still need to make a few adaptations of them, of the intervention. But what we can't do is to go beyond a certain point when core characteristics of the intervention are modified. So if we have a vaccine, if we change the adjuvant, people say, sorry, you have to test it. So we can adapt the intervention during the implementation research. We need to be careful in documenting adaptations. But if we go beyond a certain point that we create a new intervention, then maybe we are not ready to do implementation research on it.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Joseph. Thank you, Ranadeep. We have overshot our time, but if it's fine with Dr. Joseph, can we take in 2 quick questions?
Yes, certainly.
Okay, the first question is, what are the challenges of program impact evaluations to sustain or for maintenance of the implementation, especially in terms of sampling? So that is how to obtain a sample that is reliable for estimating impact of an implementation program.
Yeah, that is a difficult issue. But dependent on how you measure impact. So if your outcome is intervention adoption, it's much easier, because to be confident on the measurement of impact that you have, you only need to observe a smaller population, so you can have a subsample of the population where your program was implemented, and you can look for changes in behavior. If it is a totally new behavior, or if it was a very rare behavior in the population, again, it's very easy, because you don't need much information to justify that the changes that you have seen are very plausibly due to your success in implementing the intervention. But if you have competing interventions being implemented, then evaluation becomes a lot more complicated, and you have to go through the process of trying to identify whether there are sort of tracers of the intervention, so that you can see whether people that can remember a specific message display a message that was delivered by your implementation approach, if they display in the definition of implementation research, now very often you see that adaptation and your entitlement or expectation that you'll adapt is already part of it. So you are expected to learn while you are implementing, to make changes in your initial approach in order to be more suitable, more effective, sometimes less costly. So what is important is to keep a rigorous approach so that all changes that you make in your model are recorded so that people that read about your research can share into your learning during implementation. So they get not only your final model, but they also get the lessons of what you tried and you had either to drop or modify. Hello?
Yeah, hello. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the answer. Question. There's one other question. Yeah, just a minute, Dr. Jose.
Yeah.
Okay, I think, Dr. Jose, I think we do not have any more questions, but would any of the panelists like to add any of their experiences in this topic?
And yeah, the two terms are used interchangeably. So I
Are you connected? Someone just talk to Dr. Jose.
Thank you, Dr. Jose.